All right, so immigration, it's been a hot button issue, and the Trump administration's really turning up the heat, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing some pretty aggressive moves lately, and it's playing out on like two main fronts. We've got the whole situation with Colombia refusing deportation flights, and then here at home we've got this surge in immigration raids in cities all across the U.S.
Yeah, and we're going to try and unpack all that today, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are the tactics being used? What could the fallout be? And, what does this all tell us about the administration's overall immigration strategy?
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot to dive into.
It is. But let's start with Colombia. Now, they initially just flat out refused to accept these deportees from the U.S.,
Yeah.
right? And it is kind of interesting. I mean, given the political leanings of their government.
Yeah. Well, the Trump administration, they didn't just sit back, right? They started applying pressure. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. We're not just talking about your run-of-the-mill tariffs here. They targeted key Colombian exports, like coffee.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's hitting below the belt a little bit, isn't it? I mean, that hurts Colombian businesses, sure, but it also, like, impacts American consumers, their morning cup of coffee. I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's a bold move.
It is. It's definitely a strategic choice.
Ah.
But it doesn't stop there, right? We also saw things like visa revocations, travel bans on Colombian officials. The administration really pulled out all the stops here. I mean, this was clearly designed to exert maximum pressure on multiple fronts.
And, I mean, you got to say, it worked, right? Colombia did a complete 180,
Yeah.
agreed to accept the deportees. They even went as far as allowing them on U.S. military aircraft.
Yeah.
That's quite the concession.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. I think it really shows just how much diplomatic pressure Colombia was under. They were kind of backed into a corner. And even though the tariffs and sanctions are like on hold for now, they're still hanging over their heads.
Mhm.
A reminder of what could happen if they don't, play ball.
It's that whole sticking carrot approach, isn't it?
Exactly.
Okay, so that's Colombia. Now, let's turn our attention to what's happening here in the U.S. We're seeing this, like, massive increase in immigration raids, and it's causing a lot of anxiety, right?
Right. It's a tense situation for sure.
Yeah, so can you, like, break it down for us a little? What's actually happening on the ground?
Well, we're seeing these large-scale operations targeting undocumented immigrants. I mean, you look at Chicago, for example. I think it was over 200 individuals apprehended in just a single week.
Wow.
And this isn't some random thing, right? And this ties directly back to the administration's campaign promises on immigration. They said they were going to crack down, and well, here we are. This is like a direct result of that.
So they're making good on their promises, I guess, but
Yeah.
but you got to wonder about the impact, right? I mean, this kind of approach, does it come at a cost?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a very real human cost to all of this. You're talking about communities being torn apart, people living in constant fear. It breeds distrust. It can have some really lasting repercussions.
Right, right. So it's complicated, right? We've got this complex situation unfolding both here and abroad.
Hmm.
So for the average person trying to make sense of it all, what are the key takeaways here? What are the big things we should be paying attention to?
Well, okay, so I think there are like three major points to consider. First, looking domestically right. These raids are creating a climate of fear and tension, no question. And that raises some really important questions about the human cost of these actions, right? And the potential for, unintended consequences. Like, are we actually making things safer or are we just pushing things further underground?
Yeah, and it seems like this approach, this hardline approach could have repercussions that go way beyond just immigration policy, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that brings us to the second takeaway, the international implications. The U.S. is basically saying we're willing to use economic and political muscle to get our way on immigration. And that can have some pretty long-lasting impacts on global relationships, alliances. It's not something to be taken lightly. And lastly, the whole Colombia situation, it really highlights how interconnected these seemingly separate policy areas can be. I mean, you had immigration and trade, all tangled up. And that shows you how one can be used to influence the other. It's all connected.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we've seen how these tactics play out both at home and abroad,
Yeah.
and the consequences. I mean, they could be huge. It really makes you wonder where this leaves us in the long run, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And that's the million-dollar question, right? Is this laser focus on immigration, is it coming at the expense of other foreign policy objectives? Are we potentially sacrificing diplomatic relationships or economic partnerships, all for stricter immigration control? It's a complex issue. No easy answers. but it's definitely something worth thinking about, as we move forward.
Definitely something to ponder. All right. Well, thanks for breaking all that down for us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Keep those questions coming. We'll see you next time.